when most people think about France and nuclear weapons, they think about Charles de Gaulle, but actually most of the major decisions to put France on the path to acquiring nuclear weapons happened during the Fourth Republic when de Gaulle was out of power. What's notable about this is the Fourth Republic French leaders actually viewed nuclear weapons very similar to their British counterparts. They thought if France gets nuclear weapons, we'll increase our influence with the Americans within NATO, but ultimately they'll be part of the NATO command, or at least, adding to the arsenal. And what ends up happening is before France explodes its first bomb, de Gaulle returns to power, and he has very different views on things like alliances and France's position in the world. He doesn't care for alliances very much. He wants France to maintain its independence, and he also thinks France should be at the table with the superpowers because it's its natural role. And these views all existed from at least as far back as World War II when he was in exile living in Britain. The bomb didn't make these views. What they did is allow him to act on them. And this is most notable once France gets its first leg of its nuclear triad, the Mirage planes. De Gaulle tells NATO has to move all its bases and personnel out of French territory, and that France is leaving NATO command. So I think some people would see this and think this is great news for future cases, because if the main issues with France's bomb had to do with Charles de Gaulle, well, Charles de Gaulle doesn't run South Korea, he doesn't run Japan or Saudi Arabia. I think that's a wrong lesson. I think the point here is we can't control who runs these countries now or in the future. And even if, say, a South Korean leader that starts a nuclear weapons program but is very much in favor of the American alliance, there's no guarantee that his successors won't be a nationalist leader like de Gaulle and could use the nuclear weapons he inherits to act like de Gaulle did. Here's some other U.S. concerns the U.S. had regarding France's nuclear program. I'm again not going to go through all of them. I do want to highlight the Germany issue. It's hard to overstate how much U.S. policymakers viewed the French nuclear program through the lens of West Germany. It said that NATO was created to keep the Americans in, the Soviets out, and the Germans down. And American leaders believed that if West Germany got nuclear weapons, the Germans would no longer be down, the Western alliance would be destroyed, and antagonize the Soviet Union, possibly start a war. And of course, they felt that if France gets nuclear weapons, there's no way we're going to be able to stop the West Germans from doing so. So that's really one of their main concerns when France is pursuing the bomb. Of course, we were successful in stopping West Germany. Here's some consequences of France getting the bomb. Again, I don't want to highlight all of them, but I want to go through two. This independent nuclear decision-making, this again goes to the issue of how do you operationalize a nuclear arsenal within the context of an alliance, and it applies to France and Britain. But what I basically mean here is that when JFK comes to power, he implements or adopts this flexible response military strategy, which basically envisioned controlled, gradual escalation in the event of a conflict with the Soviet Union. So, you start off with conventional forces, and if we start losing, we might, use a tactical nuclear weapon or two in an attempt to escalate to de-escalate, as, the Russians maybe have a strategy now. And what they McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and JFK administration more broadly quickly realized is implementing the strategies becomes very difficult when you have these independent nuclear decision makers in Paris and London, because while Americans might, withhold a lot of their arsenal or all of it, there's nothing to stop the British or the French from just launching bombs at the Soviet Union. And I don't want to get into was flexible response a good idea or a bad idea. But even if you think it was a terrible idea, I think the main issue for our future cases is that these independent arsenals inhibited the U.S. from pursuing the kind of defense strategies it wanted to do. And there's no guarantee they won't in the future, even if they're good defense strategies. The other issue is this nuclear supply proliferation chain. I mentioned that the pessimists worry that if a country gets nuclear weapons, its neighbors and enemies will build the bomb to protect themselves from it. You don't really see this with any of the cases I studied. What you do see in some of them, including France, is that the new nuclear powers begin spreading nuclear technology, which allows other countries to get the bomb. These are a list of cases that either France sold nuclear technology to or was going to, and the U.S. intervened. The big one, I think, is Israel. To enlist Israel's help in what became the Suez Crisis, France offers Israel basically a starter kit for making nuclear bombs, plutonium producing a reactor and a reprocessing plant to separate plutonium to build the nuclear weapons. And without that, Israel couldn't have gotten nuclear weapons anywhere near as soon as it did, and it's possible maybe it never would, given that later on the NPT comes into force. So lessons for South Korea, again, how do you operationalize a second arsenal within the context of the alliance? Just as West Germany was central to U.S. policymakers for the French case, I think a country like Japan would be central for if South Korea got the bomb, as much as China would not like South Korea getting nuclear weapons. I think it would be at a whole different level in terms of its opposition to Japan and certainly Taiwan getting nuclear weapons. So that would be a main concern to U.S. policymakers if South Korea went nuclear. We were able to stop the West Germans from doing so, from following suit, but could we stop Japan or Taiwan? Open question. Then, of course, the big one is what if, a nationalistic South Korean leader comes into power and kicks the U.S. out of its country? And I want to highlight an important difference here, and that is, although de Gaulle kicked NATO out of France, it was a major crisis at the time. It took place in the context of a multilateral alliance. So ultimately, we can move those bases and personnel to different countries within NATO. That doesn't exist in Asia today. So if South Korea kicked the U.S. out of the country, where do we go? Is there, will someone else take us in? It's not as easy as even the French case was. So I think it'd be a major problem for U.S. policymakers. Then I also want to highlight a wrong lesson for South Korea briefly. One of the famous quotes you hear is de Gaulle explaining why France had get nuclear weapons, and he said, once the Soviet Union had ICBMs and could attack the U.S. with nuclear weapons, France couldn't rely on America being willing to trade New York for Paris. And you hear this a lot now, brought up in the context of North Korea getting ICBMs. Will South Korean leaders believe that America will trade Seoul or San Francisco for Seoul or whatever? I'm not saying this concern isn't valid to some degree, but I think you got to highlight the context here. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union possessed overwhelming conventional superiority over NATO, and NATO tried to offset that by using tactical nuclear weapons against the Soviet divisions to blunt their attack. And what de Gaulle was worried about was not that the Soviet Union would nuke Paris if they didn't believe Americans would trade New York or something. What he was worried is that the Soviet Union would invade Western Europe, and the U.S. wouldn't use tactical nuclear weapons against the Soviet divisions out of fear that Moscow would respond by nuking U.S. cities, and so that Soviet Union would be able to conquer Western Europe. And obviously the difference with in Korea today is that the U.S. rocket alliance could defeat the conventional North Korean invasion, which wasn't the case in the Cold War, so it's an important difference here.